It's a space race to AGI. And so this administration definitely wants the US to be first to AGI. And that's why they've decided to really not do hardly any regulation at all. Regulation only works if everyone is doing it, right? If the US, through this deregulation, creates something that can destroy all of humanity, and the EU has played it safe, the EU is not going to be spared.
Welcome to SaaS That App, Building B2B Web Applications, the podcast where we share real-world stories, practical advice, and tech insights for those building or thinking about starting a tech-enabled business. I'm your co-host, Aaron Marchbanks.
And I'm Justin Edwards. Each week we bring you the stories, strategies, and insights you need to build your SaaS or tech-enabled business smarter, not harder. Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to SaaS That App. Today we welcome Karynn Ikeda. Karynn is an AI strategist and leader driving AI adoption for engineering at Babylist, the trusted platform for billions of growing families. With a background spanning software engineering, strategic operations, digital storytelling, Karynn is passionate about how technology shapes our connections and the ways we work. She's been at the forefront of digital transformation for over a decade, from early online communities to hackathons, corporate innovation, and fast-paced startups. And through her writings and talks and her blog, Karynn explores the big questions at the intersections of memory, meaning, and agency. Whether she's coaching budding technologists, designing human and digital systems, or reflecting on the past, her focus is always on amplifying the human experience through technology, which is what we're going to get into with her today. Karynn, welcome to the pod.
It's great to be here.
So Karynn, just kind of right out of the gate, your career has obviously evolved from being a consultant to leading AI initiatives at Babylist and other places, other things. So how did your passion for human connection and technology first start? And how was it that led you to your current role in AI adoption?
Yeah, I am a digital native, and I think I'm a millennial as well, but I think I had the unique experience in that my father was a technologist. I mean, he's a doctor by trade, but he loved computers. And so, even though I was born in the late 80s, I had a computer basically as far back as I can remember. And he got on the internet as soon as that was available. And so I, had these experiences of using the internet. I think Greek mythology was my obsession when I was very young, and the library was not enough. And so I think I've had all these experiences from a very early age where technology was such an enabler for me for how I learned. And I think as I started to get older, a lot of that was brought into kind of the careers and roles that I chose to take. It was about teaching people how to use technology. I think very early on in consulting, I was teaching people how to blog. And, ever since then, it kind of evolved from that to social media. I did kind of go, I think too far into the online pendulum at one point, and that's why I kind of swung back to events, but it was still very much centered around the technology was the reason for actually bringing people together and being in these events, everything from sort of meetups to hackathons. I also contacted for really big conferences like Google I/O and the Lean Startup Conference. And, you meet people who I think are so energized about that, about technology and about, how it can amplify the human experience. And I think when that role ended, it was sort of well, do I actually want to learn how to build these things? And so that led me into sort of my, I guess, current path, which was software engineering to staff engineer, and then now as an engineering manager at Babylist.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think we have a lot in common in our history. In a former life, I too was the family and friends go-to IT person, as I think so many of us are as we get our feet underneath us. And then also did a lot of training myself, in corporate America, in the business world, for people coming in the door with no understanding at all of what a spreadsheet is or what software I might use to manipulate it, and then how do I manipulate it when I get there. So yeah, I think a lot of us fall into those categories, and it just kind of leads us either away from it because we're so sick and tired of it, or toward it because we want to do it better, right? We all want to see that technology grow. And now you're very steeped in the land of AI, which is of course everywhere. It seems it's obviously a hot topic. It's a big thing. Everybody wants to either learn about it or get involved with it. Or there are, of course, still the bucket of people that are very fearful of it, and we want to run in the opposite direction as fast as we can so that, Terminator doesn't get us or whatever. So, kind of getting into the land of AI as you have become this strategist, as much as anything else, and you've led these AI adoption initiatives, both with the company that you're in now, Babylist, but also in your coaching, dealing with teams, dealing with up and coming developers, training new folks. What do you see as like the big challenges that are facing those teams, people who maybe are not as comfortable or familiar with this kind of technology and how they might incorporate it either in their learning or their training or their business?
Yeah, I think it is the learning aspect of it. You have to remember that a lot of the people, they're at, the middle, sometimes even the high point of their careers. They're very good at what they do, or at least they thought they did, right? And now you're basically asking them to go back to a beginner's mindset, learn something that they've never actually needed to be successful in their role, and then telling them, actually, no, this is now essential to your role, and that you will need this in the future to be successful. And I think it's hard for a lot of people. Some people have never had to do that. I mean, I am a serial career switcher, so I've done this so many times. I think I've gotten so comfortable with not knowing things and starting over and being in that beginner's mindset again, that I think it's a comfortable uncomfortableness if you can ever get to such a place. But I think for a lot of people, it's really confronting, and it is a mindset shift of being I think more tolerant to be like, yeah, I'm going to take the time to learn this, and I'm probably going to suck a lot at the beginning, but I'm going to like get over that, and then once I do, it's going to be such a huge unlock for me.
How do you address the people who are a little further away or very much resistant or skeptical, in regards to AI, even if they have a learning mindset, it just you hit a wall. It seems like sometimes when you're like, okay, we really need to utilize AI as a tool, as an integration, as a portion of your business. How do you deal with people who really push back hard and really kind of are resisting this right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like you actually just have to meet them at like a very human level. I think there are different reasons why people are pessimistic or resistant. In fact, I was recently at a webinar. I think it was Thursday Strategy. It's this boutique consulting firm. They did a whole study around the population around pessimists and optimists. And I think pessimists are actually like a third of the population. It's a very huge number. I mean, it's not like in this minority, and you actually see very different like usage and adoption patterns, right? Based on this idea of if you identify as an optimist or a pessimist. And I think a lot of them are concerned about the impact that it will have on society. I know, like, right, the energy costs, right, to run these large language models is also a concern for a lot of people. And I think like you don't actually, I think, allow people to get past those barriers without like really talking about like some of those ethical concerns. Or, sometimes it's actually even as simple as like, I'm so busy at my job, I don't have time to learn this, right? I'm just going to do the tried and true method of how I know to get this thing done. And so it really is honestly sometimes just also just dealing with their skepticism around overwhelm. And so you really actually have to gauge which one it is, right? Because an ethical skepticism is very different from like one of like overwhelm and just like not enough time. And you do have to, you have to know the person well enough to be able to say like, which one is it?
So I wouldn't consider myself an AI skeptic, and I think everyone in our firm uses AI every day. I don't think that's an exaggeration, both with code completion tools, debugging with large language models, image generation. We use it a lot for a lot of things. So I don't paint myself as a skeptic. I see some people who are experts in the space saying things that are very, very bold predictions that seem very out of touch with what I see AI doing. I guess, do you have like a take on that, or what would be your reaction to be kind of saying that, where there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between where AI is and what people are saying about where it is and where it's going?
In terms of like what it's capable of, like, do you think that the experts are overstating what it's capable or understating?
Dramatically overstating would be my take. For example, we're not going to have software engineers within the span of several years. I've heard that said since the mid 2010s. 5 years away from not ever having software engineers anymore, and it still seems to be 5 years away. But anyway, Not trying to disagree. I'm genuinely curious. You do have a lot more experience directly with AI and what's going on with it than I do.
I mean, I'm not an expert in the sense that like I don't work on the models directly. And I think, right, the people who are training the next right version of OpenAI or Claude Anthropic, right, have a much different vantage point because they literally are seeing the future of what consumers will be using right in the coming months. And they have a preview in that sense. I think what I will say is that, right, like AI is transforming not just products, but people and processes. And so I do think that the role of software engineer will look dramatically different in 5 years. In fact, like I'm already seeing that today within my company. So Devin is this like a first generation of an AI agent. So something completely autonomous that you can give it some instructions or a prompt and it can go out and write the code for you for a very small task. And it's functioning today at what a lot of people consider the level of a software engineer intern, meaning you have to really break it down. And sometimes you give it a task and it comes back doing something completely different than what you thought you asked it to do. I mean, that's like, right, that's with any like junior employee. It's like, oh, I obviously was not clear enough in what I wanted, right? And sometimes it generates a lot of throwaway work. But, you know, I know engineers who are working with basically a fleet of 5 of these, right? And they're not actually even actively writing their code anymore. They're just managing these AI agents. And now their job is like not that much even about writing code. It's about reviewing code or testing code, right? Which is, you know, it's still within the function of a software engineer, but the time spent is dramatically different. And I think, right, I think we treat roles as sort of like the individuals in them are all the same, but I would actually challenge and say that's not true. I think people become software engineers for different reasons. Some people actually really like writing code, like hands on keyboard, and they would hate this world, right? Where you're just now delegating all of that. Some people, and this engineer in particular that I have in mind, I think really sees code as a tool to create experiences for users. And that's what gets this person excited at the end of the day. Being able to deliver that outcome for the user, and they're going to take the shortest path there, right? So they don't actually even care if they're writing code. You know, there are some engineers who just love debugging and investigating, and that's all they really want to do. And sometimes they go down rabbit holes, right?
As Justin waves his hand.
Yeah, and so I look at this and I see like, you know, there's actually an opportunity here to like actually specialize in the thing that you most love about your job. And so like, yeah, when people say like software engineers will be gone, I'm like, I could see that. I could actually see us getting so specialized that you now have software engineers who manage, you know, fleets of AI agents. You have other engineers who have AI agents that all they're doing is debugging and maybe mitigating incidents. And you have others who maybe they still want to write code. And so maybe they're, you know, there certainly are, right? AI is not great in every language. There still are languages that don't actually have a lot of, you know, open source repos, things to train on. So maybe they go into that. I don't know. Maybe they go into the very obscure languages. It's hard to say, but I think, right, it's going to potentially drive actually even more specialization within the field.
So in a general sense, would you say then that certainly current developers, you know, people that are in some tier, some level of already doing engineering, as well as those that are coming up that are getting training and things like that, do you see this then as disadvantaging them if they are not adopting some level or some degree of AI or some variation of it? Or do you think without it they are still just fine?
I do think they're at a disadvantage because I think it is a marketplace, right? Where employers are, you know, hiring for the talent that they think will be more successful. And I think the way the industry is going is, yeah, the expectation is you need AI to be successful. And I think that is the reality. And I think, right, I think productivity is still an open question at how much productivity gains we're going to see. But I think there is a general belief that you will be more productive and produce more output. You know, whether or not that leads to the right outcomes, I think is another question. But I think the perception is you do. And so I think it becomes more of, I think, a self-marketing problem if you're not, you know, working on these tools. And I mean, it is like, right, like when React became popular, it's, you know, if you weren't at least know about it, or open to at least trying it, then, you would have just made it so like it was much harder to find opportunities, right, for roles for yourself. And I think there still for a while will be companies that are willing to hire engineers that don't have any experience or no experience, but I think those are going to rapidly dry up. And I think my other question is will those companies even be viable and be able to compete, right, in the long term if they're competing against companies that have workforces that are basically, right, empowered with these tools?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Devin, Codex is out there now. I mean, there's a lot of these different agents, and I guess we're going to qualify them as vendors in general. It's kind of an explosion right now. Everybody wants to be a part of it in some way, shape, or form, and so they're spinning up their either very niche version of AI to help it do a very specific thing, or something that's much more general with a larger language model sort of process. And I guess my question is, from your perspective, or in your own coaching with these organizations, how do you help organizations find which of these AI utilities or tools might best fit what it is that they're doing, or might best help their staff to achieve whatever goals their organization are trying to meet? I mean, there's so many out there, and a lot of them are at different degrees. Yeah,
It is a process, and I don't think there's like one right solution for every organization. I'm not working with a ton of companies, and most of this is actually like pretty informal. It's not like anyone's necessarily paying to do this with me, except for my own employer. But I think you kind of like have two models. You kind of have the companies that like want to do a lot of that thorough upfront research to find the right tool. I'm of the opinion that I think it's wasted time because the field is evolving so rapidly, right? If you start a 2-month procurement process, in 2 months, you're actually like really outdated and you're actually dealing with outdated information already, which is shocking, right? That's not the way software used to work, right? The landscape is not completely shifting in 2 months, but it is with AI. And then I think you have some other companies which are on the extreme end of the spectrum, which is like, okay, if we're living in this environment where, right, new tools are coming out every day, tools are becoming obsolete like very quickly, let's just open the floodgates to our employees to basically choose and work with any tool, right, that meets our security criteria and our data privacy and all of those like base requirements, and just say like, let's experiment, let's try, like let's live in this messy world. That ends up putting a lot of strain on the actual people in the procurement process that are required, right? Their workload has suddenly, I think, I don't know, tripled, 5 times, 10 times, I don't know, but it's a lot more than they've ever had to deal with. And so, there are things that you probably have to do to optimize, and it's not going to be as thorough, right, as like you previously would have done to onboard a vendor when it was like you were dealing with like a handful of these like per month. Now you're dealing with like potentially like half a dozen new requests each week, maybe even more. But I do think that those companies will get to a better place sooner for what works with them, because they're experimenting across a lot of different tools and they're seeing, right, strengths and weaknesses between tools. And you really only get that by, using things, right, in tandem, and being able to kind of come up with like, okay, well, maybe this works here but not here, right? It's really about like pressure testing your workflow through all these AI tools.
sure. Yeah, when we talked a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned something that kind of caught my ear. You talked about a company or a business being AI forward, and so I'm curious what your definition of AI forward is, and then if you can give like a specific example of an organization or a business who has utilized AI adoption, and it's solved a specific challenge that they were facing. We've been talking a little bit in generalities, but yeah, what tell me about AI forward, and a specific instance where it helped solve a business challenge for somebody.
Yeah, I think AI forward it starts with like the mindset of the organization. So I think even before AI gets into the product, maybe they are experimenting with the product already, but I don't necessarily think that's like a first criteria. It really is about the mindset of the organization. Usually, I would say it probably comes from leadership. So the CEO or someone in the C-suite making a statement that AI adoption within the organization, right? So internally, the employees is an important thing and right, creates that space for experimentation, creates the space to bring on AI tools and giving employees access to it. I think more maturity, right? You could tie that to performance reviews. You could have an OKR. I think different companies will tactically figure out how to make that meaningful within the organization and be able to drive some accountability. And I think for that, so Zapier, I think, is probably one of the earliest examples. They, I think, recently put out a piece kind of going through their experience of what that looked like for the organization. And this is, I think, when OpenAI first released its models, like it was making news, right? That it was like passing the LSAT and like all these things. And their leadership looked at that and it was like, oh, this is going to be a big thing for us, and like immediately started, I think it was like something like a code red or something within the organization to actually like get companies to start using this. And I think flash forward today, they do have AI in their product. And I think that their understanding and the maturity to which they're talking about AI is just dramatically different from like other companies who are just starting now. You know, they are really thinking about like how you transition users. And I think they're actually really adept at this because, you know, Zapier historically is a very technical product, right? You're building these workflows. And so they, you know, have this idea of like, you go from like a dumb non-AI workflow to then an agentic workflow where you're kind of like adding in and sprinkling in AI to then like you can actually move on to their full-fledged like agent product, right? So they've already kind of thought about like these steps in betweens. And I don't think they would have gotten there purely just thinking about this, right, within the product technology org, right? This is really about the whole organization thinking about AI together. And they're also dogfooding their product, right? So they're actively using their product internally, right, for everything that they do. And so I think it's like, right, one of the things about using these tools every day, right, whether you know, you're in marketing or sales, right? Or some part of the org that is, you know, not responsible for building the product, is you start having these conversations internally about like, well, what if we did this? You know, and so now you have these ideas not just coming from your product org, which is, you know, typically the org that would ideate and like figure out how to get these into the actual product that you're selling to customers, but you have it coming from across the org. And I think it's that sort of like AI forward mentality that will make, you know, these companies competitive in the long run, because they're actively thinking about, you know, what is the user experience like based on their own user experience of using these tools.
Got you. And then on the flip side of that, is there like a common mistake or misstep that you see with businesses or business leaders or even startups when they're trying to in some way work with or integrate AI into their products or workflows?
I mean, definitely a company who says like, don't use AI at all, or like won't let you, or actually like maybe like describes it as like you're cheating. I would for sure leave an organization if that was like their mentality, because I think it would completely torpedo my career. And that would, I think, actually like put me as like, right, someone in the marketplace like at a extreme disadvantage. I don't get the sense that we're seeing a ton of organizations like that. I think, you know, leaders are trying in different capacities. I would say like maybe if there's just no leadership, right, you kind of get this very like disorganized, right, rollout of AI that is sort of like will really only benefit the power users of your organization. And, you know, they'll probably get so good at what they do, they'll probably end up leaving and going somewhere else where they can just work with people, right, who their colleagues, you know, want to do this and work with these tools.
Well, can you just speak a little bit to how Babylist is using AI and some of the cool things that you guys are doing in-house with AI?
We are definitely experimenting. My SVP of engineering made the statement to our engineering org that he wants Babylist employees, especially within engineering, to be in like the top 1% of AI users in terms of productivity, creativity, and focusing on the things that matter. Don't ask us how we're measuring this,
That was going to
because
be my question.
we
How do
are
you measure
still
that?
working. We are still working on that, and that is definitely an internal debate. But it is, I think, everything that I've already spoken about, which is like giving our engineers access to different agentic tools. I think in particular, Windsurf has been one that a lot of our engineers are using. We started using Devin a couple months ago. Within the organization, with like more broadly within Babylist, within the organization, every department is also looking at an AI strategy as well in terms of like how it can influence and be impactful in terms of productivity for each of their workflows. And so that definitely has been a very big push from leadership right down into middle management. And like we are actively looking about like how do we enable employees, what are the right tactics, whether it's workshops or demo days or hackathons, that's definitely an active discussion within the organization.
Do you have any practical tips for kind of integrating these agentic models and different AI tools that are writing code for the organization into code quality standards and into kind of the organizational process to ensure that these tools are producing code that's maintainable and that can be understood and isn't introducing vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, part of what we're starting to look at now. It's like, okay, we can clearly like generate code fast, or at least some of the people on the team can. And now, right, PR review, pull request for the non-technical people here is the bottleneck, right? And so right now we sort of handled that by previously you only needed one other engineer to review your code. But like if now you're putting up the code, right, it's not like the human writing it is no longer like right in the loop. And so now we have like two humans that are actually reviewing it. And that's sort of like our guardrail. I don't think that's scalable over time. And so I think that becomes probably the next problem that we tackle is figuring out, okay, how do we maintain code quality or maintainable, scalable code? I do think that a lot of the tools today are really good at like getting you from 0 to 1, right? So they perfect for like a startup if you're just trying something and you don't actually have to deal with like large scale and performance, right? Because you don't have that many users. But certainly beyond that, I think that's where these tools really struggle with today. May not be the case a year from now, but certainly, right, a lot of these mature companies are not going from 0 to 1, right? They're way beyond 1 at this point. I would say Babylist is beyond 1. And so like you just have different concerns at that point. And so I guess maybe to kind of go back to your question, it depends on where you are as a company. I think if you are in that 0 to 1 stage, I wouldn't worry so much about the code quality. I mean, you have a lot of startups now that are like AI first, where like the engineers are vibe coding the entire product. And I think that's probably fine until they get to 1. And then they might actually just have to rewrite the entire product from scratch.
They can do the expensive task of rewriting the product from scratch after they've proved product market fit, after they have revenue. Yeah, I mean, I love that for building the first thing. I think that it's awesome. To give you an idea, which you might play with, I was doing a landing page and had AI. I was basically vibe coding a landing page for something and had an issue with positioning, and AI gave me a really, really bad answer to this kind of arcane CSS problem I was having. And so I said, hey, AI, give me 3 reasons why that answer was terrible. And then it told me the correct way to do it. And then the AI was able to be like, you're right, that was a really awful thing that I suggested, and here's why. So I love the idea of having the AI write the code, having maybe 1 or 2 different AI models do the first pass on the PR to give the actual human who's going to do the review things to check out, or areas of concern or things to dig into more. It's kind of a cool idea.
We haven't tried this yet, so this is kind of like just an experiment that I thought about. It'd be really interesting to like pressure test different models against one another. So you could have it like, one model produces it and you bring like, say it's OpenAI, even though I think most engineers don't prefer OpenAI. Let's just go with OpenAI. And then you have like Claude or like Google Gemini review it. Maybe you bring in like an open source model like Llama and be like, constructive criticism, what's wrong, right? And if you get like multiple models agreeing on the same thing, like maybe that's actually what you just need. You just need to find consensus amongst all the models around like, well, what are the actual things that are, right, like the developer should focus on? Because if like, 3 out of 3 models say like, fix this, it probably means you want to maybe fix that, right? But if like there's a lot of disagreement, then you're like, okay, maybe that's a more subjective change, and I think that actually mirrors a lot of like, right, human review. Like code is subjective, right? How you write it, it is subjective. And if you get multiple engineers saying like, yeah, you need to fix that, then it's like, oh yeah, I really do need to fix that. But like, yeah, if you have disagreement, then like, okay, well, that maybe wasn't so clear that actually that change needed to happen.
yes, to shift gears dramatically, I want to, ethics aside, I want to move into like regulation a little bit. So obviously there's an explosion of AI tools. Everybody's like, we've talked about this, this process of kind of vetting these, whether it's for a startup or for an individual or someone who is coming up and, learning a particular subset of these to build their career. On the extreme other end of that, my concern has always been kind of from the start, the balance that needs to happen with the regulation of these tools and their utility and how people leverage them. Of course, I don't want to teeter too far into copyright, but that's obviously also a big issue. So I guess my question kind of is, what is your general take on the regulation of these tools and utilities? And then two, how do we balance the regulation with this rapid growth and the innovation and adoption of these AI tools?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, full disclosure, my husband is German. And so we actually often talk about this from the lens of like what the US is doing from a regulation standpoint to what the EU is doing from a regulation standpoint. And I think that they are right different models. Right. The EU is, in fact, much more regulated from like even like the training data that they can use. Right. Where in the US, right, you mentioned copyright. I think it is a free for all. And I think that right with this administration has already sort of made a stance that they're not going to regulate. So like I think right we'll see what happens right in the next presidential election. Things could swing exactly in the opposite direction. I think there's different pros and cons, right, to doing it this way. Certainly, you're probably going to get much more innovation upfront, right, without the regulation. And I think that's one of the reasons why this administration has decided to do that because they see, China as a competitor, right, around AI, and they want to like it's our modern day space race essentially. It's a space race to AGI. And so this administration definitely wants the US to be first to AGI and that's why they've decided to like really not do hardly any regulation at all. I think the EU is much more concerned around these issues around safety, around security, around doing this thoughtfully, right? Not creating like this doomsday scenario, right? And I think it's interesting because I sort of feel like regulation only works if everyone is doing it, right? But I'm like, it's because like if the US, right, through this deregulation creates something that can, knock on wood, like destroy like all of humanity, and like the EU has played it safe, like the EU is not going to be spared at the end of the day. And so I think at that point I'm sort of wondering like what regulation is actually gaining them, except right, it's making them far less competitive and all the talent that actually really wants to like push AI forward, like accelerate it, is moving to the US. So it's also like contributing to brain drain. I think my husband is like a great example of this. I asked him, well, would you want to like go back to Europe and like do AI there? He's like, no, why would I? Like they're so like backwards looking. And I'm like, okay, well, I didn't say that. He did. He grew up there. So
Karynn, where are we going? What's next? What do you see 2, 3, 5 years down the road with AI?
yeah, I feel like I can go in a lot of directions with this.
I want it to be super fun.
No more
Yeah,
software engineers. We got that one covered.
Yep.
I mean, I think it comes back to this idea that like AI is transforming like people and processes, not just products. And so I do think that like 3 to 5 years, like it will just dramatically transform our world. And I do mean I think both like potentially for the good, but also like maybe also just negative consequences. And I think, right, like outside of AI, we're living in such a turbulent time of change, right? Both within this country, there are dramatic calls that have been going on for change on so many levels within the wider world, right? Things are changing. And I think like if you look through history at like these moments of change and like the interaction with technology, it's interesting that you bring up copyright. Copyright is a tech invention of technology. And I actually sort of predict that like AI will lead to, I guess, the beginning of the end of copyright, in my opinion, because like copyright only came into being because of the printing press. And the printing press was this dramatically transformational technology. Like if you really look at what the printing press enabled, this like mass production, mass of text, right? Like you can trace this back to Martin Luther and the Catholic Reformation, right? So much of like the American and the French Revolution would not have been possible without printing the ideas of the people who wanted to topple these governments. And so it's like, right, when you introduce like change needs to happen in the world with a transformational technology, you get a lot. And I actually think we are in one of those moments right now, or at the beginning of one of those moments where the technology and what is happening in the world are going to collide, and they're going to lead to some dramatic social, political, potentially like even religious changes that I don't think we've really seen for several centuries.
Karynn, this has been super informative, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights. This has been great. Thank you also to my partner in crime here, Justin, who is in the South American lands these days, joining us from afar. So if you don't recognize his background, that's why. Friendly neighborhood traveler.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
We have been talking with Karynn Ikeda, AI strategist for engineering at Babylist, among many other things. Karynn, where and how can people reach you if they'd like?
If you want to follow along an AI strategy, LinkedIn is probably the best place for that. I also have a blog that's like a little bit more philosophical. Also, I think delves more into kind of like my personal experience with technology. I'm a bit old school in that I still feel like you should have different spaces for different parts of yourself and what you offer. I understand that like not everyone wants to be bombarded by AI strategy, certainly not my parents, but they are actually interested in how I'm thinking about technology. So I try to have different spaces for slightly different audiences, depending on what you're interested in.
Well, special thanks as always to our listeners as well. If you like what you're hearing, have ideas for the show, or just want to tell us what's on your mind, throw a review our way, hit subscribe if you are so inclined, and we will see you all next time on SaaS.app. Thanks for cruising along with us on SaaS.app. We hope you grabbed some insights that were inspiring, actionable, or at least entertaining.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Until next time, keep building, keep growing, and keep those apps sassy.